If you stand on West 72nd Street long enough, if you let the city's noise thin out in your head, you begin to notice what the Dakota's really doing. It is not simply there. It is watching the great arched gateway, dark as a held breath, yawns open like a mouth that never fully closes. Above it, stone faces and grotesques stare down with the indifferent patience of creatures that have already outlived your panic. And right here, at this very threshold, New York keeps one of its most unsettling coincidences. A coincidence so neat it feels staged, so cold it makes you wonder whether history sometimes chooses its own props. In 1968, Roman Polanski needed a building to play the role of a beautiful trap, a gothic shell where evil could wear good manners, where a young couple could be welcomed with smiles while something rotten waited behind the walls. He chose the Dakota, the building that became the Bramford in Rosemary's Baby, a landmark of modern horror, a story in which the devil's child is born not in a cave or a castle, but in a luxury apartment house with tasteful curtains and polished brass. 12 years later, 12, that number that feels almost mythic in how often it returns, another kind of horror arrived at the same address. Not fiction, not a camera angle, not a score rising to warn you, just the blunt, unimaginative violence of a handgun and a man who had mistaken obsession for destiny. On the night of the 8th of December 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota, at the edge of that same archway, the place built to protect the privileged from the chaos of the street. And with that, the Dakota became something more than an old, famous building. It became a question that refuses to shut up. Was it cursed? Was it haunted? Or is the real haunting something we don't like? Admitting that extreme privacy, extreme separation, extreme entitlement can turn a home into an echo chamber, and that echo chamber can attract the kind of mind that confuses a locked gate with a dare. Here is the trick. The Dakota plays on us. It makes superstition feel reasonable, because look at the symmetry. A horror film uses it as the perfect stage for a secret cult, and then real life delivers a real death at the same door. Your brain wants patterns. It wants meaning. It wants to believe buildings carry a residue like smoke trapped in velvet. But the Dakota's darkness doesn't need ghosts to be chilling. Its true menace is architectural and social. It is a fortress designed to keep the outside noise. Poverty, unpredictability, the common pulse of the city. Built in the early 1880 seconds and completed in 1884, commissioned by Edward Cabot Clark, the singer sewing machine magnate, and a developer with a visionary sense for where New York's money would someday want to live. The Dakota rose when this part of Manhattan was still rough-edged, half-developed, mocked for being far from the fashionable center of town. People joked that Clark had built so far uptown he might as well have built in the Dakota Territory, an insult that hardened into a name. The kind of name that sounds playful until you realize it's also a declaration. We are so wealthy we can treat distance like a joke. And from the beginning, the Dakota did not behave like a typical apartment building. It presented itself like a medieval confidence. Thick walls, deep-set windows, a sense of mass and weight that says, nothing gets in unless we allow it. The building's style is often described as German Renaissance revival, with steep roofs and ornate details that feel imported from an older Europe, an old world costume tailored for America's new money. The arched entrance is not merely a door, it is a passage, a funnel, a controlled transition from the street into an inner world courtyard. Quiet, separation like stepping through a border checkpoint into a private country. And this is where the story sharpens, because the Dakota's legend is not only about a movie and a murder. Those are the bright pins people use to remember it. The deeper story is about selection, about a social machine so refined it becomes cruel. The Dakota is a co-op, and that single fact changes everything. You don't just buy an apartment, you apply to a board, you submit your life to scrutiny. You wait to be judged not only on money, but on fit, on reputation, on perceived noise, on the risk you represent to the building's self-image. It is one of the few places in New York where wealth alone does not guarantee entry, where a famous name can be treated as vulgar if it threatens the building's preferred quiet. And whether every rejection story is perfectly true is almost beside the point. The legend persists because it captures a real social instinct, the desire to keep the gate not just locked but exclusive, to live behind a barrier that proves daily that you are not part of the crowd. So when people ask, was the Dakota haunted? I think the better question is, What happens to a human mind inside a monument to separation? What happens when safety becomes a philosophy, then a lifestyle, then an identity? The fear of the city, the messy democracy of sidewalks and strangers can harden into something like contempt. And contempt, dressed up as standards, can rot into paranoia. The building begins to feel less like housing and more like membership. Less like a home and more like a vow. We will not be touched. But history has a brutal sense of humor. Because the night Lennon died, he was doing something radically ordinary, coming home. The fortress did not fail because the walls were thin. It failed because walls cannot protect you from the randomness of human fixation, from the kind of delusion that doesn't care about stone. And that is the central irony we will keep circling. The Dakota was built to keep out the world's ugliness, yet it became the site where the world's ugliness arrived with perfect timing, as if to mock the very idea of being untouchable. To understand why the Dakota feels like a story waiting to happen, you have to rewind past the headlines and the folklore, back to a Manhattan that would look unrecognizable to most modern eyes. In the early 1880 seconds, the Upper West Side was not the polished, desirable address it would later become. It was a rough, muddy frontier by the standards of polite society, patches of development separated by emptiness, a place where the city's confidence thinned out and the streetlights of reputation didn't reach. Downtown was where the money performed itself, where the fashionable crowds confirmed one another's importance. Uptown, this far uptown, was where you went, if you had a reason, not a dream. And that is precisely what makes the Dakota's birth so revealing. It was not built for the present. It was built for a future that only a certain kind of mind could see, an investor's imagination mixed with an aristocrat's appetite for distance. Edward Clark, the man behind it, was not a romantic builder. He was the president of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, a figure shaped by the logic of industry, scale, efficiency, control. He understood how the modern world worked, how money could be made, multiplied, translated into permanence. And like many of the Gilded Age's most effective architects of wealth, he also understood a subtler equation. Status is not only what you own, it is what you can refuse to share. Space is the first luxury. Quiet is the second. Separation is the third. So Clark did something that seemed absurd to his peers. He planted a massive, ornate apartment building in a district they still regarded as inconvenient, even faintly ridiculous. People laughed. Because laughter is how the comfortable defend themselves against the unfamiliar. They joked that he'd built so far north he might as well have built in the Dakota Territory, a jab that carried a whiff of condescension, as if Manhattan's map were a social hierarchy and Clark had placed his monument among the lower ranks by mistake. But the joke stuck, and in sticking it became prophecy. The Dakota began as mockery, it hardened into brand. And brands have power precisely because they turn other people's opinions into your own badge. Yet the name is only the surface. The deeper decision was architectural. Clark did not build an ordinary apartment house. He built a statement that looked back across the Atlantic toward Europe's older symbols of permanence and power. At a time when New York was still inventing itself, still uncertain whether it was a marketplace or an empire, the Dakota arrived wearing a costume of authority. Its silhouette and detailing drew from German Renaissance revival, steep roofs, ornate dormers, deep recesses, heavy masonry. It did not suggest convenience, it suggested endurance. It did not whisper home, it announced stronghold. The building's mass is the first thing you feel. Even in photographs, it does not flatten easily. There is a thickness to it, literal and psychological. The windows sit like guarded eyes, not like invitations. The corners hold their ground. And then there is the entrance, the famous archway, an opening that functions less as a doorway and more as a filter. You do not drift into the Dakota the way you drift into a lobby. You pass through. You are permitted. You cross from the street, public, unpredictable, democratic, into an interior world designed to be controlled. That interior world, the central courtyard, is not just a charming feature, it is strategy. A courtyard is an old idea. It pulls life inward, away from the street. It creates an inner climate, an inner rhythm, an inner privacy. It tells residents, even without words, that what matters is inside. And the effect is almost theatrical. Outside, the city roars and rearranges itself every hour. Inside, the building holds still, preserving a mood. It's a spatial metaphor for privilege. The world can change, but you do not have to feel it. Look up at the building's decorative details, and you'll notice something else. The faces, the grotesques, the stone expressions carved into the architecture like frozen commentary. Call them gargoyles if you like, though here they are less about medieval drainage and more about medieval attitude. Watchers, guardians, ornaments that flirt with menace. There is a reason these shapes work so well in our imagination. They suggest that the building has opinions, that it has a temperament, that it can judge you. And once a place begins to feel like it can judge you, it begins to feel like it can exclude you even before anyone speaks. This is the part many stories skip because it's less sensational than an assassination, less cinematic than a horror film. But it is the foundation of everything that follows. The Dakota was designed to solve a social problem for the ultra-wealthy of its time. That problem was not, where will I live? It was, how will I live without being disturbed by the consequences of everyone else's life? New York in the Gilded Age was an engine of inequality. Fortunes erupted overnight. Poverty thickened in the shadows. Immigration and industry churned the streets into a restless crowd. To be rich in such a city was to live in constant proximity to reminders that you were outnumbered. And proximity is uncomfortable. So the Dakota offered not just comfort, but insulation. Insulation from noise, from grime, from the press of strangers, from the feeling that the city belonged to anyone other than you. And this is where the building becomes more than architecture. It becomes ideology in brick. It teaches its residents a certain posture, the posture of being protected. Over time, protection can become expectation. Expectation can become entitlement. Entitlement can become a kind of fragility because the more you design your life to avoid friction, the more any friction feels like an assault. In that sense, the Dakota is not merely a fortress against the outside world. It is also a machine that manufactures a particular kind of inner world. Quieter, safer, yes, but also narrower. More curated, more suspicious of disruption, more likely to treat difference as danger. And now, with that context in place, the next turn in the story becomes inevitable. Because a fortress is not only a structure, it is a rule book. A fortress decides who belongs and who does not. A fortress requires gatekeepers. And the Dakota, as the years pass, will become famous not simply for who lives there, but for who is not allowed to live there, how wealth can still be rejected, how fame can still be deemed common, how the building's private government can exercise a cold, surgical power over the lives that want entry. In part 3, we'll step into that secret society logic, the co-op board, the rituals of approval, the brutal elegance of exclusivity, and we'll ask what it does to human beings when their home is also a tribunal. There is a particular cruelty that only refined places can practice. It is not the blunt cruelty of poverty or street violence. It is not loud. It does not shout. It smiles. It thanks you for your interest. It shakes your hand with perfect manners while quietly deciding you will never belong. The Dakota's most notorious power is not its stonework, not its Gothic arch, not even the legends that cling to it like winter fog. Its real power is administrative. The building's ability to say no in a way that feels like fate. Because the Dakota is not simply a building you purchase your way into. It is a co-op, meaning you are not just buying square footage, you are asking for membership, you are seeking entry into a controlled organism, a private country, with its own small government, its own standards, its own invisible anxieties. And in New York's social ecosystem, that difference matters. Condominiums sell space, co-ops sell permission. This is where the fortress becomes psychological. If a place is built to keep the world out, it must constantly answer one question. What counts as the world today? In the 1,880 seconds, the world might have meant noise, dirt, and the working class density downtown. In the 20th century, it could mean something subtler. Publicity, spectacle, the wrong kind of fame, the wrong kind of energy. A co-op board's job is to protect property values, yes, but in buildings like the Dakota, it also protects identity. The building is a brand. The building is a myth. And once you are a myth, you become terrified of anything that could puncture the illusion. So the gatekeepers evolve. They don't look like guards in uniforms holding rifles. They look like well-dressed adults behind polished doors, reading financial statements as if they were sacred texts. They ask for references. They ask for interviews. They request disclosures that would feel invasive almost anywhere else. And then, if they don't like your answers, they can reject you, not with scandal, not with explanation, but with a neat finality. In much of New York, money negotiates. At the Dakota, money still bows to taste, and taste is often only another word for fear. This is why the building collects rejection stories the way Old Velvet collects dust. The stories travel through the city like warnings. You can be rich and still be refused. You can be famous and still be refused. You can be admired by millions and still be judged not suitable by a handful of people who have decided the building's peace matters more than your identity. Whether every celebrity anecdote is perfectly accurate is less important than what the anecdotes reveal. New York believes the Dakota can say no, and New York believes the Dakota enjoys it. That belief becomes part of the building's aura. It strengthens the mythology of exclusivity, the idea that this is not a place you simply reach, but a place that chooses you, like a cold god. And consider what that does to the people inside. A fortress does not merely protect, it shapes. When your home is defined by exclusion, you begin to experience the city as threat. Every stranger becomes potential disruption. Every noise becomes intrusion. Every new neighbor becomes a question mark. Safety then stops being a condition and becomes a mood. And moods, unlike conditions, can always get worse. A person who lives by the logic of protection can become addicted to protection. They can begin to seek it not only from danger, but from discomfort, from contradiction, from the simple fact that other people exist with their own chaos. In that sense, the Dakota is a gilded cage that teaches its residents how to fear. Not necessarily fear of violence, though fear loves to borrow any excuse it can, but fear of contamination. The fear that the outside world will seep in through sound, through scandal, through gossip, through the wrong headline. You don't have to be cruel to become complicit in this. You only have to be tired, protective of your family, protective of your quiet. You only have to believe just a little that you deserve a smoother version of reality than most people do. The building makes that belief feel normal. It makes it feel responsible. And when responsibility and entitlement start sharing the same vocabulary, you get something very dangerous: moral confidence. The conviction that your comfort is a virtue, and anyone who disturbs it is a problem to be removed. And yet, the building's very design, its insistence on separation, creates a kind of magnetism for obsession. Because the more you hide, the more you invite curiosity. The more you signal untouchability, the more you become a symbolic target. The Dakota's gate is not just an entrance, it is a line drawn in the street. On one side, the city, open to anyone. On the other, a private world, curated, guarded, withheld. That boundary is seductive. It can inspire reverence in some and resentment in others. It can even provoke the kind of mind that interprets a boundary as a personal insult, a challenge, a stage. John Lennon, ironically, represented the opposite energy. He was global, beloved, porous to the world, an artist whose work invited people in, whose music belonged to crowds. And yet, he chose the Dakota as a home because, like anyone who has been chased by attention long enough, he craved quiet. He craved ordinary domestic life. He wanted to step out of the spotlight and become a man walking through a doorway with groceries, a husband, a father, someone whose most private moments didn't have to be performed. The Dakota promised that kind of invisibility. It promised insulation. It promised the privilege of not being constantly touched by strangers' hunger for you. This is the cruel paradox at the heart of the episode. The very systems built to preserve peace can sometimes intensify the conditions for violence, not because the building causes it, but because the building becomes a symbol. And symbols attract people who want to insert themselves into history. People who want to be seen by destroying what others love. People who don't understand art but understand attention. So when we arrive at the night of the 8th of December 1980, we are not arriving at a random tragedy in a random place. We are arriving at the collision point of multiple currents, the old Gilded Age dream of isolation, the co-op culture of curated belonging, the modern phenomenon of celebrity and obsession, the psychological tension between safety and exposure. The Dakota is the meeting place of those forces. A fortress that wants to be invisible becomes famous for its darkness. A building that sells privacy becomes a landmark that strangers pilgrimage to. A gate that is meant to keep people out becomes, in the end, the very stage where the outside world delivers its most unforgiving message. You cannot fully control what touches you. In part 4, we step into the frozen seconds of that night, the ordinary walk home, the shadow at the archway, the sudden sound that made the world feel unreal. And we watch how a place designed for protection becomes the setting for a loss, so public it still echoes decades later. The 8th of December 1980 did not arrive with the theatrical warning we expect from tragedy. It arrived like any other winter day in New York, cold enough to make breath visible, ordinary enough to lull you into routine, busy enough to make you believe the city's motion is a kind of protection. That is the lie Manhattan tells you. If everything is moving, nothing can truly happen to you. Lennon and Yoko had lived in the Dakota long enough for the building to become a rhythm rather than a landmark. The archway, the courtyard, the routines of coming and going, these were no longer Gothic details in a tourist photograph. They were the quiet frame around a private life, and Lennon needed that frame. By 1980, he had been many things to many people: revolutionary, icon, pop genius, symbol, target, inspiration, irritant. But the human body can only live as a symbol for so long before it starts begging to be a person again. The Dakota offered a kind of refuge that was not just physical but psychological, a belief that home was home, that the street could be shut out, that the most violent parts of the world belonged to out there. The building's very attitude, its thickness, its guardedness, its inner court made that belief easier to hold. The Dakota did what fortresses have always done. It made safety feel like a law of nature. That night, Lennon and Yoko returned to West 72nd Street after time spent away ordinary movement inside an extraordinary life. There were no grand gestures, no armored convoy, no dramatic dash. This is important because it exposes the most human detail in the story. Lennon was not trying to be untouchable. He was trying to be normal. He was trying to live as if the world's hunger for him could be negotiated with routine, as if the city's chaos could be domesticated by a consistent path home. In a way, it is the most New York thing imaginable, to believe that if you walk with enough familiarity, the city will accept you as one of its own. But the city is not a person. It does not accept, it contains, and waiting near the Dakota's entrance was a different kind of contained thing. A man who had been turning his own mind into a sealed room. Mark David Chapman did not arrive at the archway as a stranger who suddenly snapped. He arrived as a person who had been cultivating an internal obsession, feeding it, rehearsing it, treating it like a private religion. Obsession works like a co-op board in reverse. It screens out reality, rejects nuance, refuses complexity. It chooses one story, one target, one fantasy of meaning, and then locks the rest of the world outside. The Dakota's archway, that controlled passage into privacy, became the perfect stage for such a mind. It is shadowed. It is dramatic without trying. It turns an entrance into a threshold, exactly the kind of place where a delusion can feel cinematic, fated, right. This is the bitter irony. Architecture can't create evil, but it can provide evil with atmosphere. The building's gateway didn't cause what happened, but it did something almost as haunting. It made the moment feel like it belonged there, as if the place had been waiting. And then the sound happened. Not a roar, not a long struggle, just gunfire. The most brutal punctuation mark a human being can add to another human life. 5 shots. That number is so specific it feels like a curse. A handful of seconds, and the world you knew rearranged itself. The glass of ordinary time shattered, and suddenly there was no before that could be returned to. Lennon was hit and fell near the entrance of the building that had been designed as a refuge for the people the city could not safely touch. In the moments after, everything becomes a blur of instinct. The human brain does not process shock as a story. It processes shock as fragments, a cry, a sprint. The sudden realization that you are not watching an event, you are inside it. The security staff, the doormen, the people nearby, everybody becomes a body in motion, a set of hands reaching for something that cannot be repaired by hands. Yoko's grief is often described in the language of collapse, because collapse is what grief does when it is too large for the body to hold. The courtyard that once felt protected becomes an open, cold stage. The building's inner stillness, which was meant to be soothing, becomes terrifying, because stillness is unbearable when you want the world to scream back into order. And there is an image from that night that haunts, not because it is supernatural, but because it is so painfully practical. Lennon was taken to the hospital in a police car, no ambulance waiting in time, no cinematic rescue. Just urgency, the kind that strips away dignity and replaces it with speed. This detail matters because it punctures the glamour people often drape over famous deaths. In the end, the body is a body. The city is a city. And the system, no matter how polished, can still be too slow when seconds are the only currency left. The Dakota, meanwhile, did what fortresses do when something breaches them. It tightened. In the hours and days after, the building's aura changed. Or rather, it became visible. What had once been exclusive now felt defensive. What had once been private now felt sealed. The building's legend grew heavier, darker, more magnetic. Strangers came to the gate, holding candles, flowers, grief they could not deliver anywhere else. The street became a shrine. The Dakota became a wound that the city kept touching, as if touch could turn loss into understanding. And here is the cruelest part of the climax. The building did not fail because its walls were weak. It failed because walls do not solve the problem we secretly want them to solve. They do not solve fate. They do not solve obsession. They do not solve the human desire to force meaning into violence. The Dakota was built on an old promise that the right architecture, the right distance, the right gatekeeping can keep chaos outside. That promise is seductive. It is also false. Chaos is not a creature that respects boundaries. Chaos is a condition of living among minds you cannot control. So Lennon's death at the Dakota is not just a tragic historical fact. It is a symbolic collapse of the fortress fantasy. A building designed to protect the elite becomes the place where the elite's most public vulnerability is exposed. A gate designed to filter the outside world becomes the point where the outside world delivers its worst message. It is as if the city itself leaned in and whispered, "No one is untouchable." Not even here. In part 5, we'll stay inside the aftermath, inside the building's long shadow, inside the way legend hardens into atmosphere, and we'll ask what it means to live with a doorway that the world remembers, to wake up every day behind a gate that history refuses to forget. After a public death, places change in 2 ways at once. First, they change in the obvious way. Security increases, routines tighten, the building adjusts, but there is a second change, quieter and far more permanent. The place becomes a container for other people's feelings. It absorbs grief, fascination, rumor, fear, longing, and it holds them like dust in a sealed room. The Dakota did both. After the 8th of December 1980, it became more protected, more private, more controlled. Yet paradoxically, it also became more visible. The building that had been designed as a refuge from the city became one of the city's most enduring symbols, a location that strangers could point to and say, with a shiver of recognition, that is where it happened. And once a place becomes where it happened, it stops being merely architecture. It becomes atmosphere. In the days and weeks after Lennon's death, the outside world pressed itself against the Dakota's gate with the desperate tenderness of mourning. Fans gathered, candles burned, flowers piled up. The street became a soft, trembling congregation, a human attempt to make sense of a senseless act by standing near the place where the world cracked. From the outside, the Dakota must have looked even more like a fortress. Stone above, iron below, a sealed interior behind the arch. But from the inside, the sensation would have been different, more claustrophobic, more unreal. Imagine living in a building whose entrance has turned into a memorial. Imagine trying to carry groceries past strangers crying. Imagine hearing your home described on the news as a crime scene, a shrine, a myth. The Dakota's original promise, quiet, separation, insulation, was suddenly impossible. The building had become a stage, whether it wanted to or not. This is how legends feed on themselves. The more the Dakota tried to withdraw, the more it drew attention, the more it insisted on privacy, the more the public projected stories onto it. And soon, the building's earlier cultural shadow, Rosemary's Baby, the fictional cult behind respectable doors, began to intertwine with the real-life tragedy. The coincidence hardened into a narrative. This building has a dark spirit. It didn't matter that New York is full of old buildings and old crimes and old films. The Dakota had the geometry for myth, a gothic gate, a heavy face, a famous death, an earlier fiction that had already taught people how to feel uneasy. The ingredients were too perfect. The human imagination, when it smells pattern, becomes hungry. And then there is Yoko Ono, because if the building's public story is myth, the private story is endurance. For decades, she remained in the Dakota, living in the same place that held the memory of that night. From a distance, people interpret this in romantic or supernatural terms. They want the story to be poetic. The widow gazing out at the gate, the spirit of her husband lingering, the white piano, the soft echo of music in empty rooms. They want grief to behave like cinema. They want the world to make meaning by turning pain into a gothic tale. But the truth is more human, and therefore more devastating. Sometimes people do not leave because leaving would admit that the loss is won. Sometimes people stay because they need the physical geography of memory, the way a corridor, a window, a courtyard can anchor a shattered reality. To move out would be to dissolve the last tangible connection between then and now. To move out would make the death portable a thing that follows you everywhere. Staying, in a strange way, can be a form of control, one last attempt to place grief in a specific location so it doesn't devour the entire world. This is where the Dakota becomes the perfect emblem of privilege's hidden cost. We think of the wealthy as protected from the rawness of life. We imagine their walls can keep out not only noise but consequence. Yet grief, like fate, does not respect income. It does not consult boards or read balance sheets. The Dakota's thick walls could keep out street sounds, but they could not keep out the sound of memory. The archway that served as a gate became a loop. Every day, the building's residents had to pass the same threshold, the same symbol, the same point, where private life had been violently invaded by public tragedy. A fortress that once promised separation now carried a permanent imprint of exposure. And so the building's aura deepened. It became even more selective, even more guarded, not just because of practical fear, but because fear always changes taste. Fear turns openness into risk. Fear turns interesting into unacceptable. In a co-op like the Dakota, those shifts can crystallize into policy without anyone ever admitting the emotion underneath. The board can say it's about stability, about discretion, about the culture of the building. But culture is often just a polite way to describe a shared anxiety. After Lennon, the desire for quiet was no longer merely a preference. It felt like survival. Yet the irony remains sharp enough to cut. The building grows more exclusive precisely as it becomes more famous. The Dakota's name becomes a password known by millions, while its doors remain closed to most. And in that tension between public fascination and private control, the building's legend keeps expanding. People peer at it the way they peer at anything forbidden. They take photos. They whisper. They point out the arch like it's the entrance to a storybook that refuses to open. And the Dakota, in its silence, seems to confirm whatever fear you brought with you. If you arrive believing it's haunted, the stone will look haunted. If you arrive believing it's elitist, the gate will feel smug. If you arrive believing it's tragic, the darkness under the arch will feel like a bruise. But the most unsettling thought is not that. The Dakota is cursed. The most unsettling thought is that it is perfectly logical. It is the natural architectural expression of a social belief, that you can design your way out of vulnerability, that you can wall off the messy human world, that you can curate safety by curating people. The building embodies that belief in stone. And Lennon's death exposed the belief's fatal weakness. Vulnerability does not vanish when you hide. It merely waits in a different form, Which brings us to the episode's final note, the echo that lingers after the candles burn out. The Dakota is beautiful. It is historic. It is an artifact of a city's ambitions. But it is also cold in a particular way, the way any place built on separation can become cold. Its elegance is not warm, it is armored. Its privacy is not gentle, it is guarded. It is a fortress of privilege, and privilege is always haunted, not necessarily by ghosts, but by the fear of losing what it has. In part 6, we'll close the circle, what the Dakota ultimately represents, why its walls can't block destiny, and how this stone fortress points us toward the next story, New York's most famous natural paradise. Central Park, a place that looks like innocence but was built on erasure. By the time you reach the end of the Dakota's story, you realize the building has been telling you the same lesson from the beginning, just in different accents. First, it spoke in architecture. Thick walls, deep windows, a guarded archway, a courtyard turned inward like a private prayer. Then it spoke in social ritual. Interviews, approvals, refusals, the quiet power of a board deciding who fits. And finally, it spoke in tragedy. The night a man who believed he was safe walked toward his own front door and discovered the oldest truth in any city: there is no such thing as perfect insulation. The Dakota was built as a solution. It was meant to solve the discomfort of proximity. It was meant to solve the anxiety of wealth, living too close to poverty, too close to noise, too close to the unpredictable pulse of other people's lives. It was meant to offer the elite something they crave even more than luxury: control. Control over sound, control over access, control over the messy randomness of public space. In the late 19th century, that dream was almost revolutionary. We will live in a castle, it declared, and the modern city will not touch us. And yet, the building's very magnificence reveals the problem it was trying to outrun. You do not build a fortress unless you believe you are under threat. You do not carve watchers into stone unless you are haunted by the idea of intrusion. The Dakota's elegance is not just taste, it is defensive taste. Its beauty is armored. Its exclusivity is not merely snobbery, it is a survival instinct trained by a city that made wealth visible and therefore vulnerable. The fortress of privilege, at its core, is a confession. We have so much to lose that we must turn our home into a barrier. But barriers have limits. They can block sound, they can block weather, they can block the casual friction of strangers. What they cannot block is the human condition itself, the unstable chemistry of obsession, the random violence of a mind unmoored, the way history sometimes chooses a place not because it's cursed, but because it is symbolic. The Dakota did not summon tragedy like a spell. Yet, its symbolism, its gait, its legend, its posture of untouchability made it feel like the perfect stage for a person who wanted to force himself into history. That is the grim paradox. The more you design a place to be a part, the more you turn it into a target for the imagination, admiring or hateful, curious or deranged. So what is the Dakota, ultimately? It is not merely where John Lennon died. It is not merely the building that played a monster's home in a film. It is not merely a co-op famous for its gatekeeping. The Dakota is a physical metaphor for a New York idea, the belief that you can purchase distance from reality, that you can buy your way out of the city's chaos and into a private climate where the rules are different. And in some ways, you can. Money absolutely changes the texture of daily life. But the building's history proves the deeper point. Even the most expensive distance is not the same as safety. Even the thickest stone cannot guarantee the future. Even the most guarded archway cannot prevent the darkness that arrives, not as a ghost, but as a moment. If the Dakota feels haunted, it is because privilege itself is haunted by the fear that the world will eventually demand to be acknowledged. Haunted by the knowledge that comfort is temporary. Haunted by the suspicion that the walls are only convincing because we want them to be. The building stands, century after century, as a beautiful contradiction. It promises protection, but its most famous moment is a breach. It promises privacy, but its name belongs to everyone. It promises separation, but it cannot separate its residents from grief, from fate, from the simple fact that the outside world is never fully outside. And that is why the Dakota remains chilling. not because it is supernatural, but because it is honest. It tells you that the human obsession with control over people, over noise, over life's unpredictability will always be exposed eventually. You can curate your neighbors, you can close your gate, you can retreat into stone, but you cannot negotiate with time. You cannot audition your destiny. You cannot bribe the random. So we end where we began, at the archway. In your mind, you can still see it. The dark passage, the controlled threshold, the place where a building's entire philosophy meets the street. If you listen closely, you can almost hear two sounds layered over each other, like a cursed harmony. The imagined hush of privilege, nothing can touch us here, and the blunt reply of history, watch me. And now, the hook for what comes next. We've spent this episode inside stone, inside walls, inside the psychology of exclusion. But New York has another kind of fortress, one that doesn't look like a fortress at all. A place that appears open, natural, innocent. A paradise built from trees and lawns and winding paths. A sanctuary for the city's wealthy to breathe clean air and pretend, for an hour, that they are living in harmony with nature. Central Park. But the truth is, even this nature was manufactured. And like all manufactured paradises, it required a sacrifice. To create that green dream, New York erased a real community, an entire village, and displaced thousands of people, many of them Black New Yorkers, whose lives were treated as obstacles to beauty. The park is a masterpiece, yes. It is also a crime scene of policy, a lesson in who gets to decide what counts as public good, and who is allowed to remain in the picture when the city remakes itself.